Hi, I'm Margaret. I'm 66 years old, and 3 weeks ago, my husband sat at our kitchen table, counted out my grocery money bill by bill in front of me, and said, "That's all you deserve?" 41 years of marriage, and that's the sentence he chose. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just watched his hands move over those crumpled bills like he was counting out an allowance for a child. Have you ever had someone you built a whole life with look at you and decide out loud that you're worth less than you used to be? If you have, you already know the specific kind of quiet that follows. Before I tell you what happened next, and what he didn't know about where his own retirement check actually came from, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button. It's free, it costs you nothing, and it's the only reason I get to keep telling stories like mine. Stay with me. My name is Margaret Hartwell, and I live in a modest brick house on Willow Bend Lane, on the north side of Terre Haute, Indiana, the same house David and I bought in 1987 when we were young enough to still be surprised by our own mortgage payment. David is 68 now, retired for 6 years from the Vigo County Highway Department, where he supervised road crews for almost 3 decades. I raised our 2 children in that house, Kevin and Denise. And I did something else too, something David never paid much attention to. Back in 1994, when money was tight and David's overtime wasn't covering everything, I started keeping the books for 2 small businesses downtown. That little side job grew into an actual firm, Hartwell Bookkeeping and Pension Services, 3 rooms above the old hardware store, and eventually a real office with real clients. David called it my hobby for years. He still does, mostly. Here's what our marriage looks like from the outside. 2 kids raised right, a paid-off house, a husband with a solid pension, a wife who bakes for the church fundraiser every spring. Here's what it looks like from the inside, at least every Sunday evening for longer than I care to admit. David sits at the table with the checkbook and his reading glasses, and I bring him the grocery receipt, and he goes through it line by line, like an auditor looking for fraud. Eggs went up 40 cents, why 2 kinds of cereal, why a rotisserie chicken instead of a raw one, why don't I know how to cook anymore? It isn't really about the money. We have enough money. It's about him needing to be the one who decides what I'm allowed to need. Every week it's a different version of the same performance. He'll hold up the receipt like it's evidence in a trial only he's allowed to judge. Sometimes he sighs before he even reads it, like my spending has already disappointed him before he knows the numbers. Sometimes he says nothing at all, just slides a stack of bills across the table that's smaller than what I actually need, and looks at me like he's daring me to say something. I never do. I take what he gives me and I make it work, because that's what I've always done, quietly, competently, without asking for credit. Denise says, "Mom, just talk to him." Kevin says, "Dad's just careful with money." That's how his generation is. Neither of them has ever sat across that table and felt what I feel, which is that I am being audited by a man who has never once balanced our checkbook himself. I could describe that kitchen table to you with my eyes closed, the little chip in the laminate near his elbow from where Kevin used to bang his toy trucks as a boy. The smell of the vinegar cleaner Sunday afternoons always seemed to carry. The specific scrape of David's chair when he pulls it out to sit down for what I privately started calling audit night. He licks his thumb before he turns each receipt over, an old habit from counting cash drawers decades ago, and I used to find it endearing back when it meant he was careful with our future instead of careful with my worth. Now I just watch his thumb move and I count silently exactly how many seconds it takes him to find something wrong. It is rarely longer than a minute. I have gotten good over the years at making my face go soft and agreeable before he even looks up. The way you brace a muscle before a doctor presses on a bruise you already know is there. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from being underestimated by someone who's supposed to know you best. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits in your chest like a stone you've learned to carry so long you forget it's there until someone asks you to run. Have you ever gone through something like that, being treated as less capable, less trustworthy, less than by the very person who should have known exactly what you were capable of? If any part of this sounds familiar, I want you to do something for me before we go any further. Subscribe to this channel. It doesn't cost a thing. And it's the only way stories like mine keep reaching the people who need to hear them. Now let me tell you what David didn't know, the thing that was sitting quietly in my office files the entire time he was counting my grocery money. What David never bothered to ask in 6 years of retirement is how the county actually handles its pension payments now. Vigo County stopped processing retiree benefits in-house back in 2011. They contracted out the calculations, the tax withholding elections, the direct deposit files, the annual cost of living adjustments, all of it, to a small accredited firm the county trusts to get it right every single month for around 300 retired employees. That firm is mine, has been for 11 years. David's monthly pension deposit, the one he treats like it fell from heaven through his own hard work alone, gets calculated, verified, and released by 2 people in my office, and every so often on the complicated files, by me personally. He signed the original contract paperwork with the county himself 6 years ago, and never once read past the part where it told him when his money would arrive. I want to be fair to David because this isn't a story about a monster. It's a story about a man who got smaller in retirement instead of bigger and took it out on the person closest to him. He was a good provider for most of our marriage. He got up before dawn for 30 years, came home with dirt under his nails and a paycheck that fed our kids. But something changed when the county gave him a gold pin and a handshake and sent him home for good. He lost the thing that made him feel useful, and instead of finding something new, he found a way to feel powerful again by shrinking me down to a budget line he got to approve or deny. I understood that, even while it was hurting me. Understanding it didn't make it hurt less. So I said nothing, week after week, and I watched him get a little bolder every time I didn't push back. That's the thing about silence. People mistake it for surrender, when sometimes it's just patience waiting for the right moment. I didn't know yet what that moment would look like. I didn't know it would happen in broad daylight in front of half our neighbors on a Saturday morning at the farmer's market on Ohio Street of all places. I just knew, somewhere underneath the stone in my chest, that a man who builds his whole sense of worth on humiliating his wife eventually runs out of places to hide from the truth. I just had no idea how soon that truth was going to come looking for him. It didn't start as one big humiliation. It built the way water wears down stone, one small drop at a time, for years. The Saturday market was the worst of it because that's where David did his counting in public, not just at our kitchen table. He'd stand next to me at the tomato stand, watch me pick out produce, and say things like, "You don't need 3 of those, put one back," loud enough for the vendor to hear, loud enough for whoever was in line behind us to hear. I'd feel my face go hot, and I'd put the tomato back, and I'd smile at the vendor like nothing had happened, because what else was I supposed to do? Make a scene over a piece of fruit. The worst one happened back in March, at the market, in front of our neighbor Carol Jennings, who I've known for 20 years. I was choosing a rotisserie chicken for Sunday dinner, and David looked at the price tag and said, right there in the aisle, "You'd think a woman who claims to be so good with numbers would know how to shop within a budget." Carol laughed awkwardly, the way people laugh when they don't know if something is a joke. I laughed too, because that's the reflex you build after decades of this, laughing along with your own small erosions so nobody else has to feel uncomfortable. I put the chicken back and bought the cheaper one, and I thought about the fact that I had, that very morning, approved a 6-figure retirement disbursement schedule for the county's largest remaining pension fund. The math of my own life stopped making sense to me somewhere around then. I still remember exactly what that grocery aisle smelled like that day, rotisserie chicken and the disinfectant they mop the tile with every hour on Saturdays. And I remember the particular heat that crawled up the back of my neck before it ever reached my face, the kind of heat that tells you your body has already decided to be humiliated before your mind has caught up. I gripped the handle of the cart a little tighter than I needed to. I smiled at Carol Jennings, and I smiled at the man restocking the dairy case who definitely heard every word, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me even then, that I had signed a compliance certification that very week attesting, under penalty of professional sanction, to the accuracy of 11 separate pension disbursement calculations, and that not one soul in that grocery store, including my own husband, would have believed it if I'd said it out loud. When I mentioned it to Denise afterward, just in passing, not even really complaining, she said, "Mom, Dad's just old school. You know how he is about money since he retired." Kevin, when I brought it up once at Thanksgiving, actually laughed and said, "Better you than me, he'd never let me hear the end of it if I spent that much on groceries." Neither one of them asked if I was okay. Neither one of them noticed that their father had just publicly implied in front of a family friend that his own wife, who ran a licensed accounting firm, couldn't manage a grocery budget. I didn't push it. You learn after enough years which battles your own children are equipped to fight alongside you, and which ones you have to carry by yourself. Here's what nobody in my family saw, because none of them ever set foot in my office past the front desk. Every Monday morning I sit down with Carol Whitfield, my office manager, and the closest thing I have to a work daughter, and we go through the county pension files together. Verification of deposits, corrections to withholding elections, the occasional appeal from a retiree whose cost of living adjustment came in wrong. It's careful, exacting work. 1 decimal point in the wrong place, and someone's mortgage payment bounces. I have never once, in 11 years, made an error that cost a retiree their benefit on time. Not one. Meanwhile, my husband stood in a grocery aisle and questioned whether I understood the concept of a budget. The gap between those two versions of me got wider every year, and for a long time I let it. Sunday lunches were their own particular ritual of quiet cruelty. David liked to host, if you could call it that, at the head of the table, carving the roast, holding court about how tight things were getting, how retirement income doesn't stretch the way a paycheck did, how everyone in this family needed to be more careful. Then he'd look right at me and say something like, "Your mother could stand to learn that lesson too," while I was the one who'd paid for half the roast out of my own account without telling him, because I'd noticed the grocery money he'd given me that week wouldn't cover a full dinner for 6. I never corrected him at that table. I just passed the potatoes and let him have his moment because I'd already learned that correcting him in front of the kids only made the next week's counting session worse. What made those Sunday lunches harder to sit through wasn't David's voice. It was watching my own children nod along with him. Not out of cruelty, I don't think, but out of a kind of comfortable blindness children develop about their parents' marriages. A belief that whatever arrangement exists between two people who raised you must be fair simply because it's familiar. Denise would refill her father's glass without being asked. Kevin would laugh at his jokes about tightening belts. I would watch them both, my own babies grown now with mortgages and minivans of their own, and I would think, you have no idea what your mother actually does all day, and some small, tired part of me didn't correct them. Because correcting them felt like asking my own children to take my side against their father, and I had decided a long time ago that I would rather carry the weight myself than hand any of it to them. Around that same time, I started noticing something else, something small that I filed away without fully understanding why it mattered yet. David had started disappearing on Thursday afternoons, always a little cagey about where he'd been. I finally figured it out by accident, a receipt in his jacket pocket from Vogel's Jewelers downtown for a deposit on a stainless steel watch, the kind with the green face that costs more than a used car. He'd been putting money down on it for months, a little at a time, telling the man behind the counter he'd earned it after 30 years of hard labor for the county. He never once mentioned it to me. He never once connected the dots between the $15 he'd shaved off my grocery money that week and the $400 he'd quietly handed over at that jewelry counter. I didn't say anything, I just started paying closer attention. I want you to understand something about the arithmetic of a marriage like this, because it isn't really about dollars, it's about who gets to decide what matters. David could justify $400 on a watch as something he'd earned. He could not justify $8 extra on chicken as anything but recklessness on my part. That's not a budget problem. That's a belief about whose needs count. I did the math in my head more times than I'll admit, sitting in my office at night after everyone else had gone home, running numbers that weren't mine to run, calculating exactly how much of our household stability had been quietly propped up by a business he dismissed as my little hobby. I never said any of it out loud. I just kept a private ledger in my head, the way you keep score in a game you haven't decided yet whether you're going to finish playing. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the young woman I used to be, 25 years old, newly married, thrilled that David wanted to build a whole life with me. That woman kept a diary for a few years, and I still have it in a drawer in my office. She wrote about feeling capable, about feeling like an equal partner in everything, about how David used to ask her opinion on decisions before he made them. I don't know exactly when that stopped. I don't think there was one single day. I think it slipped away the same way everything slips away in a long marriage, an inch at a time, until you wake up one morning and realize the man across the table only asks your opinion on things he's already decided, and only asks it so he can overrule you in front of witnesses. My grandchildren noticed things my own children didn't, the way children sometimes do before life teaches them to look away. Ashley, Denise's youngest, only 11 at the time, asked me once very quietly while we were shelling peas on the back porch why Grandpa always got to decide what things cost, and I didn't. I told her it was complicated, grown-up complicated, the answer adults give children when they don't yet have the courage to give the real one. She didn't push, but she also didn't forget it, and sometimes I'd catch her watching David count out my grocery money with a small furrow in her brow that looked exactly like the one I used to see in the mirror at her age, long before I learned to smooth my own face into something more agreeable. By the end of that spring, something in me had gone very still, the particular stillness of a person who has stopped expecting an apology and started paying attention instead. I wasn't plotting revenge. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about a scheme. I was simply done pretending I didn't notice the pattern. David counted my grocery money like it was the only real transaction in our house, while his own retirement check, the one he was so proud of, the one he treated as proof of his own hard-earned self-sufficiency, had been quietly running through my hands, my staff, my judgment for years without him knowing a single thing about it. Something was going to give. I just didn't know yet that it would be him who broke it open, not me. That spring, the county rolled out a mandatory update to its pension administration system, something they do every few years to stay compliant with state auditing standards. It meant every single retiree file needed to be re-verified, tax elections reconfirmed, direct deposit information reauthorized, beneficiary designations checked. For my office, it meant 6 weeks of unusually heavy work, cross-referencing 300 files against updated county records. For David, it meant nothing at all yet, except a letter that would eventually arrive from the county administrator's office asking him to confirm some paperwork. He hadn't gotten that letter yet. I had already seen his file cross my desk twice that month, flagged for a mismatch in his Medicare premium reimbursement election, something that happens more often than you'd think when retirees fill out forms without reading them carefully. I noted it, the way I noted every file, and moved on to the next one. Meanwhile, at home, David had apparently decided that being careful with money wasn't cutting it anymore. He needed to be in control of it. He came home from Vogel's Jewelers one Thursday with a small green box he didn't bother hiding, set it on the counter like a trophy, and told me he'd finally bought the watch, paid it off in full that afternoon. $480 cash. I said it was beautiful because it was, and because I'd learned long ago that pointing out a hypocrisy to David never landed the way you'd hope. It just made him defensive and made the following week's grocery counting worse. That same week, my grocery allowance dropped again, this time by $20 with no explanation offered, no discussion invited. I adjusted the way I always did and said nothing. I want to be honest about something, because this isn't a story where I was a saint quietly suffering with a soft smile the whole time. There were nights that spring when I sat alone in my car in the office parking lot after everyone else had gone home, not ready to drive back to a house where I'd be handed an amount of money like a child receiving an allowance, and I let myself be furious, really furious, gripping the steering wheel and saying things out loud to an empty car that I would never have said to David's face. I am not proud of how much I rehearsed arguments I never had. I am not proud of how many imaginary conversations I won in that parking lot and then lost completely the moment I actually walked through my own front door. But I think that rehearsal, that private fury, was doing something underneath the surface, quietly convincing me that I deserved better than I was getting, long before I had any idea how that better was going to arrive. The real turning point came at Denise's house during a family dinner in early May, with Kevin and his wife there too, and Carol Jennings, who Denise had invited along with her husband. David had a few beers in him and started talking, the way he did when he wanted an audience, about how a man needs to take charge of his household finances properly, how he'd been too lenient letting me handle so much for so long. Then he said it, right at the table, loud enough that everyone stopped eating. Starting next month, I'm taking over the finances completely. All of it, the checking account, the budgeting, everything. Your mother means well, but she doesn't really understand where our money should go. Denise laughed nervously. Kevin nodded like this was reasonable. Carol Jennings looked at her plate. I looked at David and said, "All right," and passed him the green beans. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because I certainly did for weeks afterward. A man announced in front of our children and a family friend that he was taking full control of our household finances from a woman who ran a licensed accounting practice that, unbeknownst to him, was the exact institution processing his own retirement income every single month. I could have said something right then. I could have told him calmly that he might want to reconsider that plan, given who actually understood the numbers in this family. I didn't. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I'd decided somewhere in that quiet stillness I'd been carrying all spring that I was done proving myself to people who'd already made up their minds about me. Let him find out on his own. Let the truth do the work I was tired of doing. The following Monday, I sat down with Carol Whitfield in my office, the same Carol who'd been with me for 9 years and knew more about my marriage than my own children did, mostly because she'd watched me take calls from David during work hours for almost a decade. I told her what happened at Denise's table. She just shook her head slowly and said, "Margaret, you signed off on his cost of living increase yourself last quarter. You do know that, right?" I told her yes, I knew. I'd known for 11 years and I'd never said a word to him about it because it never seemed like the right moment and because some small, stubborn part of me had always believed he should be the one to find out, not be told. That same afternoon, David's flagged file came across my desk a third time, this time with an actual deadline attached. The Medicare premium reimbursement mismatch had escalated into something the county's compliance office required in-person verification for. A new state regulation meant retirees whose files showed unresolved discrepancies for more than 90 days had to appear at the administering office directly, present identification, and sign a corrected election form before their next disbursement could be released without a hold. David's 90 days were up in 11 days. The letter notifying him of the requirement had already gone out from the county administrator's office that morning on official letterhead directing him to the office address on file. My office address? That same week, completely unrelated to David's file, our office went through its own annual state audit, the kind that makes every accountant I know lose sleep for a month beforehand. An examiner from the state board spent 3 days going through our procedures, our reconciliations, our client files, mine included, and left us with a clean report, 0 findings, the best outcome a firm like ours can get. Carol brought in a small cake to celebrate that Friday, and I remember standing in our little break room, eating a slice off a paper plate, thinking about how strange it was that a state examiner had just spent 3 days confirming in writing that I was exceptionally good at, exactly the thing my own husband didn't trust me to do with a grocery budget. I could have called David that night and explained the situation before the letter even arrived, softened it, walked him through it privately at our own kitchen table where no one else would see his face change. Carol actually asked me if I wanted to do exactly that. I told her no, not out of spite and not out of some plan to embarrass him, I promise you that. I told her no because I had spent 30 years quietly protecting David from ever having to see the full picture of what I actually did, and handled and carried, and I was tired, bone-tired, of being the one who managed everyone's comfort at the expense of my own. If the truth was finally going to surface, it could surface the way it was supposed to, through the process, not through me pulling him aside to soften a blow he'd been dealing to me for years, without ever once softening it himself. So I let the letter do what letters do. I didn't call him. I didn't hint at it over dinner. I went to work the next morning like it was any other Tuesday, reviewed 42 files, approved 9 disbursements, and set David's folder in the stack for the following week. Same as anyone else's, no special treatment, no warning. Somewhere across town, in a mailbox on Willow Bend Lane, an envelope with a county seal on it was waiting for a man who believed down to his bones that he understood money better than his wife ever could. He had no idea that in 11 days he was going to walk into an office expecting a bureaucrat and find me sitting behind the desk that mattered. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, and I watched David open it at the kitchen table from across the room, pretending to be absorbed in a crossword puzzle. He read it twice, frowned, and muttered something about the county turning into a bureaucratic nightmare since they contracted everything out to outside firms instead of handling things in-house like they used to. Probably some clerk who can't read a file straight, he said, tossing the letter onto the counter. He had no idea, none at all, that the outside firm he was complaining about was the same one that had kept our household financially stable through 3 of his least employed years in the 80s. The same one he called my hobby at every Sunday dinner. I picked up the letter later that night after he'd gone to bed and read it carefully, twice, in the quiet of my own kitchen. He mentioned the letter to me exactly once more, 2 days later, in the same tone he used to complain about the weather. "I've got to go down to some office next week and sign some form about my Medicare deduction. Some mix-up with the paperwork," he said, not really asking, just informing me the way you'd inform a roommate rather than a wife. I asked him if he knew what the mix-up was about. He said he didn't, and honestly didn't care. It was probably some clerical error on their end, not his. I could have told him right then exactly what the mismatch was. Could have explained the whole reimbursement election process to him in about 90 seconds, because I processed exactly that kind of correction every week. I asked him instead if he wanted me to look at the letter for him. He said no, he'd handle it himself, he didn't need help balancing a form. That week David seemed almost lighter than usual, humming while he shaved in the mornings, the particular good mood of a man who believes an inconvenience is beneath him rather than something that might actually matter. He mentioned the appointment once more at breakfast, joking that he'd probably be in and out in 10 minutes, home in time to take his boat, well, the boat he was still deciding on, out for a look before lunch. I poured his coffee the way I did every morning, and I watched him fold the newspaper under his arm with the easy confidence of a man who has never once had to wonder whether the world was quietly keeping score on him. I remember thinking almost gently that he had no idea how much was about to be asked of that confidence. I mentioned the appointment to Kevin over the phone that weekend, mostly just making conversation, and he laughed it off the way he laughed off most things involving his father. "It's just paperwork, Mom. Dad'll be fine. He probably just checked the wrong box on some form. Not a big deal." Denise, when I brought it up, asked if David was stressed about it. I told her he didn't seem stressed at all. If anything, he seemed annoyed that something as trivial as a form correction required him to leave the house on a weekday. Neither of my children asked what office the letter was directing him to. Neither of them had any reason to connect a county pension compliance visit with their mother's business, because as far as either of them knew, I did some bookkeeping for a few local shops downtown. Nothing more substantial than that. At the office that week, I walked Carol Whitfield through the exact procedure for David's appointment, the same procedure we used for every retiree flagged under the new 90-day rule. He would need to bring photo identification, sit with one of our benefits specialists, review the discrepancy in his Medicare premium reimbursement election, sign a corrected form, and have that form notarized by our office notary before his next disbursement could be released without a hold. I told Carol I wanted his appointment handled exactly like anyone else's. No special notice, no early warning that his own wife happened to own the firm. She looked at me for a long moment and asked if I was sure. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything in 11 years. 3 days before his appointment, David came home from Vogel's Jewelers, again, this time to have his new watch's band adjusted, and mentioned almost as an aside that he'd also put a deposit down on a fishing boat he'd seen at a dealership out on Route 40. Something with a proper outboard motor, nothing fancy, just something he'd earned after all those years on the road crew. That same week, my grocery allowance stayed exactly where it was, $20 lower than it had been in January, with a comment about how eggs shouldn't cost what they cost, and I ought to shop smarter. I stood at the stove that night, boiling water for pasta, and thought about the $480 watch on his wrist and the boat deposit in his wallet, and I didn't say a single word out loud. I just kept stirring. I want to tell you what that particular kind of restraint costs a body, because nobody talks about it enough. I started getting headaches that spring, right at the base of my skull, the kind that come from clenching your jaw in your sleep. Carol noticed I'd started rubbing my temples during our Monday file reviews and asked if everything was all right at home. I told her it was nothing, just tired. The same lie I'd been telling for years, the same lie so many women my age tell, because admitting the truth feels like confessing to a failure that isn't actually yours. I started keeping a bottle of aspirin in my top desk drawer, right next to the old diary, 2 different decades of coping mechanisms stacked one on top of the other. And some mornings I would open that drawer and just look at both of them for a moment before I got to work. If you're still with me, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever watched someone spend freely on themselves while making you account for every dollar of your own needs and felt that particular quiet fury that has nowhere acceptable to go? I carried that fury for a long time before I understood that I didn't need to scream it into existence. I just needed to let the truth stand where it already was and stop protecting the people who wouldn't have protected me the same way. If this story is landing for you the way I think it might be, please take a second and subscribe to this channel. It's free, and it's what lets me keep sharing these stories with people who need to hear that quiet doesn't mean weak. We're getting close to the part where everything changes. Stay with me. The night before David's appointment, I lay awake next to him for a long time, listening to him breathe, thinking about how strange it was that after 41 years I could still feel like a stranger in my own marriage bed. I thought about warning him one last time, softening the blow before it landed. I thought about all the times he hadn't softened anything for me, the tomato at the market, the rotisserie chicken, the announcement at Denise's table that he was taking over everything. I thought about the young woman with the diary in my desk drawer and what she would have wanted me to do. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I made peace with letting it happen exactly the way it was going to happen, without my interference, without my protection, for the first time in longer than I could remember. The morning of his appointment, the office looked the way it always looked on a Thursday, quiet and orderly. 6 retirees in the waiting room with their folders and their reading glasses. Carol Whitfield at the front desk in her cardigan. The county seal certificate framed on the wall next to my own CPA license, the one David had walked past exactly twice in 11 years without ever once asking what it said. I had a full morning of appointments myself, corrections and verifications stacked up from the system rollout. And I told Carol I'd be in my office with the door mostly closed, handling my own files, unless she needed me. I wasn't hiding. I want to be clear about that. I was simply doing what I did every single Thursday, running my business, the one David called a hobby. At exactly 9:40 that morning, I heard the front door chime, the same chime it always made, and I heard a voice I would know anywhere, even muffled through my half-closed office door, asking Carol Whitfield where he was supposed to go for a pension paperwork appointment. I froze for just a second, my pen still on the page in front of me, and then I heard him say the name on his letter out loud, Hartwell Bookkeeping and Pension Services, like he was reading it for the very first time, and only just now, noticing whose name was actually on the sign above the door he'd just walked through. Carol Whitfield, in the calm, practiced voice she used for every retiree who walked through that door, said, "Of course, Mr. Hartwell. Let me just pull up your file for Mrs. Hartwell's review, if you'll have a seat right there." David didn't move for a second. I heard the silence from my office, the particular silence of a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. "Mrs. Hartwell," he repeated slowly, like the words didn't fit together the way they should. Carol, who had no idea she was standing in the middle of the exact moment I'd been quietly waiting 11 years for, simply nodded and said, "Yes, sir. Margaret owns the firm. She'll want to look over this correction herself, given the compliance deadline." I stood up from my desk. I walked out of my office the same way I walked out every single day, folder in hand, reading glasses pushed up on my head, and I watched my husband's face do something I'd genuinely never seen it do in 41 years of marriage. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the specific blankness of a man watching a wall he built around his own understanding of the world come down in real time, brick by brick, in a room full of strangers. He looked at the county seal certificate on the wall. He looked at my CPA license next to it, the one he'd walked past without a glance more times than I could count. He looked at me standing there in my own office, in front of 6 retirees who all knew exactly who I was, and he said my name like a question. Margaret. I said good morning to him, the same tone I'd have used with any client, because in that moment, professionally, that's exactly what he was. I told him I understood there was a discrepancy in his Medicare premium reimbursement election that needed correcting before his next disbursement could be released without a hold, and that Carol would walk him through the corrected form, and that I'd review and countersign it myself once he'd signed, since files under the 90-day compliance rule required a second signature from the firm's principal. I watched the word principal land on him. I watched him understand, in real time in front of an audience, that the woman who'd been counted grocery money in front of strangers for years was the same woman whose signature released his retirement check every single month. An older gentleman in the waiting room, a retired county mechanic named Walter, must have picked up on David's confusion, because he leaned over and said, in that friendly, oblivious way strangers have of making things worse without meaning to, "Oh, you're in good hands. Mrs. Hartwell caught an error on my file 2 years back that would have cost me $1,100, saved my whole Christmas that year." David didn't respond. He just sat down slowly in the chair Carol had pointed him toward, the folder with his name on it already open on the desk in front of him, my handwriting visible on the tab, the same handwriting he'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards for 4 decades. Now attached to the exact document that controlled whether his pension check arrived on time. Carol walked him through the correction with total professionalism, exactly the way she'd walk any retiree through it, explaining that his Medicare Part B reimbursement election had been entered incorrectly during the system migration, that it needed to be reconfirmed and signed, and that our office had flagged it and sent the required notice per the new state compliance rule. She didn't know, and didn't need to know, that every word out of her mouth was landing on David like a small, precise correction to an entirely different kind of file, the one he'd built in his head about who understood money and who didn't. He signed where she pointed. His hand, I noticed, wasn't quite steady. When the form was ready, I came over, sat down across from him at that small side desk, reviewed the corrected figures out loud for the record, the way I would for any file, and then signed my own line underneath his. Principal signature, Margaret R. Hartwell. I slid the form back across the desk so he could see it clearly before it went into the file. He stared at my signature for a long moment, the same signature that had signed his birthday cards and his kids' school permission slips, and it turned out his own retirement checks for 11 straight years, and he didn't say anything at all. Walter, still nearby, said cheerfully, "You're all set now, sir. Mrs. Hartwell doesn't let anything slip through." And I thanked him and told David his corrected disbursement would process on schedule, no further action needed on his part. I want you to understand, I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't say a single sentence I wouldn't have said to any other client that morning. I didn't lean into it, didn't smile in a way that said, "I told you so," didn't give him the satisfaction of a scene he could later describe as me embarrassing him in public. I gave him exactly the same calm, competent service I gave to Walter and to the other 5 retirees in that waiting room, because that's genuinely who I am, and because I understood, sitting there, that the situation itself was doing every bit of the work I'd spent years wanting to do myself and never had the heart to. The truth didn't need my help. It just needed a room full of witnesses and 11 minutes. When it was over, David stood up, folder in hand, and for a moment I thought he might actually apologize right there in front of Carol and Walter and the county seal on the wall. He didn't. What he said, quietly, just to me, was, "Why didn't you tell me?" I told him just as quietly that I had tried, more than once, in more ways than one, over 11 years, and that he had never once asked me a single question about my work that wasn't followed by a joke about my hobby. I told him his disbursement would be back on schedule by Friday. I told him I had another appointment in 10 minutes. I watched him understand that this conversation, the real one, wasn't going to happen in my waiting room in front of clients, and that some part of that was exactly what he deserved. He left without another word, and the office went on being an office. I finished Walter's file, saw 2 more retirees, approved a disbursement correction for a widow whose late husband's survivor benefit had been miscalculated, and by lunchtime, the whole morning felt almost ordinary again, except for the specific quiet hum underneath my ribs that hadn't been there in years. I didn't call David, I didn't text him. I let the day be exactly what it was, a Thursday with files and appointments, and a truth that had finally found its own way to the surface without me having to drag it there myself. That evening, driving home, I thought about all the versions of myself David had decided I was over the years. The woman who didn't understand budgets, the woman with the quaint little hobby, the woman who deserved exactly what he decided to hand her across a kitchen table. I thought about how none of those versions had ever been true, not for one single day, and how the only reason they'd survived as long as they had was because I'd let them, because correcting him always seemed like more trouble than it was worth. Something had shifted quietly, permanently, somewhere between Carol's calm greeting and my own signature under his. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt like a woman finally standing in the actual size of her own life instead of the small shape she'd been folded into for years. David didn't bring it up again until that night after dinner, after the dishes were done, sitting in the living room with the television off, which was its own kind of announcement. He said he'd been thinking about it all day. He said he felt foolish sitting in that waiting room, hearing a stranger call me Mrs. Hartwell like I was somebody important, and realizing he'd never once thought of me that way himself. I told him I understood why. I told him it was easier to think of your wife as somebody who needed managing than as somebody who'd been managing quite a lot, including apparently his own retirement for over a decade. He didn't argue with that. That, more than anything else that day, is how I knew something had actually shifted in him. He tried in his own limited way to explain himself. He said retirement had made him feel useless, that counting the grocery money had never really been about the grocery money. It had been about needing to feel like he still controlled something after 30 years of controlling road crews and budgets and other people's schedules. I told him I'd figured that part out a long time ago, and that understanding it hadn't made it hurt any less every single Sunday for years. He didn't have a good answer for that. He just sat there, turning his new watch around his wrist, the one he'd never once connected to the $20 he'd shaved off my grocery budget, and said he was sorry, actually sorry in a way I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. I told him calmly what was going to change, because an apology without a change is just a nicer sentence attached to the same behavior. I told him there would be no more counting my grocery receipts, no more announcements about who controlled what at family dinners, and no more treating my business like a hobby he was too important to ask questions about. I told him if he genuinely wanted a partnership around money going forward, we would sit down together as equals and look at the whole picture. His pension, my firm's income, our joint savings together on a schedule we both agreed to. Not one he assigned to me from the head of the table. He agreed. I want to be honest, I don't know yet if he'll hold to it forever. I know he held to it that week and the week after, and that's more than I'd had in years. It wasn't a single conversation that fixed 41 years of an imbalance, and I want to be honest about that too, because I don't want you to think one Thursday afternoon rewired a whole marriage overnight. The first week David slipped once, almost out of muscle memory, and asked to see the grocery receipt out of habit before catching himself halfway through the sentence and just saying, "Never mind, that's your business." I didn't say anything smug about it. I just handed him his coffee and let the moment pass, because I understood, better than most people would, that undoing 30 years of a certain kind of control doesn't happen in one clean motion. It happens in 100 small corrections, the same way a pension file gets fixed, one flagged line at a time, patiently until the whole thing finally balances. Denise heard about it first, from Carol Jennings, who'd apparently mentioned to her husband that David had a scene at some pension office, and word travels fast in a town the size of ours. When Denise called me, half laughing, half stunned, asking if it was true that Dad found out at Mom's own company that Mom processed his pension, I told her yes, all of it, plainly, without dressing it up. She went quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us what your firm actually does?" I told her the same thing I'd told her father, that I had tried, in small ways, for years, and that none of them had ever really been listening, because none of them had ever needed to. Kevin took longer to come around than his sister did. He called me almost a week later, sounding oddly defensive, as if his father's humiliation were somehow a referendum on him too. He asked if I'd done it on purpose, engineered some kind of scene to embarrass Dad in front of strangers. I told him calmly that I hadn't engineered anything, that a state compliance rule had simply required his father to walk into my office, like any other retiree, and that I couldn't be blamed for 11 years of his father, assuming my work wasn't worth asking about. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, quietly, that he supposed he'd never really asked either. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to one I'd gotten from my son in a long time, and I decided to let it be enough. The fishing boat deposit, it turned out, got cancelled that same week quietly, without David making a production of it. He didn't mention it to me directly. I found out from the dealership calling to confirm the refund on our joint card statement, which going forward, we now actually review together every month at the kitchen table, side by side, instead of him at the head and me waiting to be handed an amount. The watch stayed on his wrist. I never asked him to return it, and I want to be clear that this was never about punishing him for buying himself something nice. It was about the fact that for years his nice things were treated as earned, and my basic groceries were treated as a privilege I had to justify. Once that distinction disappeared, the watch just became a watch. Some nights now, I sit at my kitchen table after David has gone to bed, the same table where he used to count my receipts line by line, and I take out that old diary from the drawer I keep it in, the one belonging to a 25-year-old woman who believed, without question, that she was an equal partner in her own life. I don't read it out of sadness anymore. I read it because I recognize her again, finally, after a long time of not quite seeing her in the mirror. I think she would be proud of the 11 years I spent quietly building something that mattered, even when nobody at that table noticed. I think she would be proud that I never once needed to raise my voice to be taken seriously in the end. I closed the diary that night, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed next to a man who finally understood exactly who he'd been sitting across from all along. If there's a version of you listening right now who's been made to feel like your competence doesn't count unless someone else validates it, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need a dramatic public reveal to know your own worth, though I'll admit mine helped. What you need is to stop protecting the people who benefit from your silence and start letting your own truth stand in daylight, even quietly, even patiently, even if it takes 11 years to reach the surface on its own. If this story has meant something to you, please subscribe, share it with someone who's been counted out one too many times, and know that every person who does that helps keep these stories going. We're almost at the end. Thank you for staying with me this far. These days, David still comes to the market with me on Saturdays, but he doesn't stand over my shoulder counting tomatoes anymore. Last week, he actually asked me, genuinely asked, whether the rotisserie chicken was a better deal than the raw one this month, and waited for my answer like it mattered, like I might actually know something he didn't. I told him yes, it usually was, given how prices had moved, and he just nodded and put it in the cart. It's a small thing. I know it's a small thing, but after 41 years and after 11 years of a truth quietly running underneath our whole marriage without his knowledge, a small thing like that felt like an entire correction, signed, verified, and finally released. If I could tell you one thing from all of this, it's that being underestimated by someone who claims to love you is one of the loneliest kinds of pain there is, precisely because it hides in plain sight, disguised as concern, as caution, as somebody just being careful with money. It took me most of a marriage to understand that the solution was never to prove myself louder. It was to stop needing his permission to know what I already knew about my own worth. You don't have to stage a confrontation to reclaim your dignity. Sometimes the truth just needs enough time and enough of its own weight to walk into the room on its own and introduce itself properly, the way mine finally did, in a waiting room on an ordinary Thursday with a county seal on the wall and my own name on the door. He told me that first day at our kitchen table, "That's all you deserve," and handed me a stack of bills he'd decided were sufficient for a woman he didn't think understood money. What he didn't know, the whole time, was that I understood his money better than he understood his own life. that my judgment released his retirement check every single month, that the woman he was diminishing across that table was the same woman quietly keeping an entire county's promise to its retirees intact. I never once threw that in his face out of spite. I let it simply be true, and let the truth do what it does best when you finally stop shielding people from it, which is arrive exactly on schedule, precisely when it's needed. I'm 66 years old, and it took me until this year to fully understand that I get to decide what I deserve. Not the man across the table, not my children's comfortable assumptions about who does the real work in this family, not anybody's outdated idea about what a woman my age is capable of understanding. I deserve to be spoken to with respect at my own kitchen table. I deserve credit for 11 years of exacting, careful work that quietly held up more than one household, including, as it turns out, my own husband's. And I deserve, finally, at 66, to stop shrinking myself down to fit inside somebody else's low opinion of me, whether that somebody is a husband, a client, or anyone else who ever decided my worth was theirs to set. If this story reminded you of your own life, or someone you love, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with them. It costs nothing, and it's the only way I get to keep telling these stories to the people who need to hear that quiet women keep very good books and very long memories, and that the truth, given enough time, always finds its way to the surface on its own. Thank you for listening to me today. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next one.